All right, we're going to start to shift our focus now to real-world perspectives. You're going to hear from the primary stakeholders in this session, but we're going to start off with a little bit of a retrospective on the history of post-acute care, again, to give a little bit of context to where we've been so we know where to go. First speaker is Dr. Ann Deutsch. Ann is a clinical research scientist at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. She's going to provide this brief review of the history of post-acute care in the U.S. with an eye toward lessons learned. Dr. Deutsch.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak. So, as you mentioned, I'll be focused on a brief history of the post-acute care settings in the U.S. with a special focus on inpatient rehab facilities. So on the next slide, you'll see that inpatient rehab facilities are one type of post-acute care. The other types of post-acute care providers that I'll be referencing in my presentation today include skilled nursing facilities, sometimes referred to as SNFs, home health agencies, as well as long-term care hospitals. So when the acute care prospective payment system was implemented in the mid-1980s, there was a need to distinguish inpatient rehab facilities, both units and freestanding rehabilitation hospitals, from acute care units. So there was a committee formed at the request of the Healthcare Financing Administration to identify criteria that would distinguish inpatient rehab facilities from acute care units. And that's where some of the work and discussions about the 3R rule, as well as another rule called the 75% rule at the time, were established. By the early 1990s, post-acute care was the fastest growing area of the Medicare program. There were more providers across all the post-acute care settings. There was a higher number of people being treated in post-acute care settings. And of course, that meant there were higher costs in inpatient rehab facilities as well as other post-acute care settings. So this, of course, meant there was some attention focused on post-acute care. This increase in the cost, the number of people being treated, as well as the number of providers, was a result of the acute care prospective payment system, resulting in shorter acute care stays, and patients who were leaving acute care were not really ready to go home to self-care, and so many of them were admitted to post-acute care facilities to get that additional skilled care before they returned home to self-care. So inpatient rehab facilities were actually excluded from the acute care prospective payment system because diagnosis alone was not a significant predictor of IRF costs. Therefore, there was a need to collect clinical data. And on the next slide, you'll see that there in the post-acute care settings in the 1990s, there were 3 patient assessment instruments that were implemented. And the clinical data on these post-acute care assessment instruments, and those are in the inpatient rehab facilities, the IRF-PI, or the Inpatient Rehab Facility Patient Assessment Instrument. In the home health setting, it's the OASIS, or Outcome and Assessment Information Set. And in the skilled nursing facilities, it's the minimum data set. So these clinical assessment instruments were implemented so that data were being submitted, clinical care data were submitted that would help provide information that was used for monitoring quality of care, as well as data such as function data that were used in the future prospective payment systems for each of these settings. I do want to highlight on this slide that each of the item sets were developed by respective experts in their field. And so the inpatient rehab facility patient assessment, for example, was derived from the uniform data set for medical rehabilitation. And that was actually developed by experts in the IRF industry. And there were home health experts developing the OASIS, and the minimum data set was developed by experts in the nursing home industry. but these data sets were not actually developed in alignment. And so there were differences in the data elements and how they were operationalized in each of these different data sets. So on this next slide, what I'd like to highlight is that when the prospective payment system came to the post-acute care settings, they were also not aligned. So in addition to having different data that were being used to implement these prospective payment systems, the design of the payment systems were also implemented in a way that were not aligned at the time. So for skilled nursing facilities, for example, it was a payment unit that was per diem, whereas the home health agencies at the time had a 60-day episode payment unit, and inpatient rehab facilities and long-term care hospitals had a per discharge payment unit. And this meant that there were different incentives for the different types of post-acute care providers. For example, in skilled nursing facilities, there was a focus in, or I guess the payment incentives were to reduce daily costs, whereas in inpatient rehab facilities and long-term care hospitals, the focus is on reducing stay level costs. Next slide. So as you can imagine, policymakers were starting to ask questions such as who received post-acute care, what factors are associated with the receipt of care in the different post-acute care settings, and what are the costs of care in the different post-acute care settings, and what are the short and long-term patient outcomes across these different post-acute care settings. On the next slide, the early research to address the first two questions about who gets post-acute care and who gets different types of post-acute care found that certainly patient factors such as diagnosis, functional status, living arrangement, and age were related to who received different post-acute care in different post-acute care settings. But it also found that market or facility level factors were also playing a factor in who received post-acute care and what type of post-acute care. So factors included geographic region, the supply and ownership of facilities, as well as managed care penetration at that point in time. So again, the uneven distribution of each type of post-acute care provider meant that some patients with similar characteristics were being treated in different types of post-acute care settings with different costs and different payment. On the next slide, I just wanted to highlight some testimony that was given by the director of the Center for Medicare Management back in 2005 to the House Ways and Means Committee that focused on an example of a woman who was 74 years old, who had had a total knee replacement and a wound infection. And as you can see from the slide, this demonstrated that this person, she had been treated in a different type of post-acute care. The payment rates in $2,003 did vary considerably. So this person, again, recovering from a knee replacement, would have an estimated payment of about almost $11,000 in an inpatient rehab facility. In a skilled nursing facility, it might be between $4,000 and $6,000. Long-term care hospital would be about $17,600, and in home health about $5,000 for that 60-day episode. So the costs were easy to compare, but of course there were other questions. On the next slide, the question about the payment led to a lot of questions about whether there was basically substitution of care that was happening across the different types of post-acute care settings. So here are just some of the reports that talked about this issue of substitutability. And what I mean by that is that some patients with similar characteristics were being treated in different post-acute care settings. And because the payments may vary depending on the type of post-acute care, that this was a concern for policymakers. So, of course, the next reasonable question is, well, is the quality of care different? Are there better outcomes when the costs are higher? So on the next slide, you'll see that the Impact Act, which was mentioned by Dr. Corrigan, was passed as a law in order to help address the comparison of patient outcomes. And I think Dr. White did a great job explaining that there is methodological concerns, issues, difficulties, challenges in comparing outcomes across different types of post-acute care settings. But in addition to that, we had the challenges that the data being collected in the different post-acute care settings were not aligned. And so what I wanted to highlight here is that the Impact Act did require that post-acute care providers be required to collect standardized patient assessment data so that these quality measures could be developed, and that would allow potentially for some better comparisons of the outcomes of patients treated in the different post-acute care settings. On the next slide, I just wanted to highlight a potential lessons learned from the other requirement that I mentioned, not the 3-hour rule, but this 60% rule, which was formerly called the 75% rule. So for those of you not familiar with it, the 60% rule is a Medicare regulation that says at least 60% of an inpatient rehab facility's population must be one of 13 specified medical conditions. And of course, traumatic brain injury is one of those conditions. And what I wanted to highlight as a potential lesson learned from that is that after CMS began enforcing the 60% rule in the early 2000s, some IRFs, inpatient rehab facilities that did not specialize in the care of patients with traumatic brain injury or spinal cord injury began to admit these patients with these conditions. So prior to the enforcement of the 60% rule, they had been taking care of patients with orthopedic conditions. And so with the implementation or enforcement of the 60% rule, these facilities who may not have been qualified or had the expertise for care of patients with TBI and SCI were actually admitting some of these patients, and some of them may not have received the best quality of care. So just moving on to the next slide, just quickly wanted to highlight that the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission had an idea that they wrote up recently in some of their reports about the idea of having post-acute care competencies as a requirement for providing care. They said that potentially there could be a basic level or tier 1 of common set of requirements, and then for providers who treat patients with specialized needs, and their examples were patients requiring ventilator support or complex wound care, there could be a tier 2 that spells out competencies for that specialized services. So on the next slide, there's just a little bit more detail about that, but they gave examples in their report about stroke and spinal cord injury as examples. On the next slide, just wanted to highlight that there are concerns about the feasibility of implementing such tiered competencies-based requirements, because shifting to a skilled-based competencies and requirements that would are specific to different types of patients would be a substantial change from existing regulations, and it would require different regulations potentially for institutional versus home health agencies. And developing and implementing this would take many years. So on the next slide, just wanted to highlight that fortunately, Dr. Giacino and his colleagues have developed competencies for people who are with disorders of consciousness. And so again, there is this potential to take this into consideration. So just to, I guess, summarize what I was speaking about is that the 3R rule was originally developed to differentiate IRFs from acute care hospitals but it has now been used to differentiate between post-acute care providers, and that the lessons learned from the 60% rule is that perhaps not all IRFs are qualified to provide care to people who have disorders of consciousness. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to you, Dr. Giacino.
Thanks so much, Dr. Deutsch. These insights in how we got here are extremely valuable so that, we don't A, repeat the errors of the past, and B, improve now because we have evidence we didn't have before. All right, so I want to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Joe Finns is Professor of Medical Ethics and Professor of Medicine and Chair of the Division of Medical Ethics at Weill Cornell Medical College. Dr. Finns will share his thoughts on prevailing bioethical issues associated with post-acute TBI care. I think he will also venture into the sort of legal side of this discussion. He is one of the most eloquent speakers on these topics, and it's my real pleasure to introduce him in person. He's standing next to me. So welcome, Dr. Finns.
Thank you, Joe. And I hope I'm eloquent and informative. I'm really honored to be here and to be with such a wonderful group of panelists. I want to talk about the ethical mandate to do rehabilitation and get a little bit out of the weeds and into our aspirational goals of what kind of clinical system we want to have. Flora mentioned the guidelines that was back in 2018 and that Joe led, actually. And I want to just kind of highlight one point that I was honored to write the ethical palliative and policy commentary that came in tandem with the guidelines and the systematic review. And as I was doing it and reading so much of the material, one thing struck me, and that's what at the bottom of this slide, that despite all the progress that's been made, the fact that we're in a golden age of brain science, the fact that Jeff Manley can decrease the mortality rates in a way that's reminiscent of Cushing neurosurgery in the early part of the 20th century. The fact that we have evolving therapies and drugs like amantadine that Joe and John White showed was effective. Patients are still dying of complications in the acute care hospital. And importantly, these guidelines said there's no such thing as the permanent vegetative state because 20% of people who were thought to be permanent can actually get better. Part of it is complicated reasons. The fact is knowledge is evolving. But the thing that really struck me about these guidelines was in the details. And that was, despite all this progress, when they look back at the 15 years that they were looking at, there was a decrease in rehabilitation days. Makes absolutely no sense. How are people going to benefit from the fruits of neuroscience if we limit their ability to benefit from that progress? So I want to talk about somebody who kind of embodies the promise and the peril of the time that we're in. And this is Terry Wallace, the man who woke 19 years after a traumatic brain injury from a car accident in Arkansas. And he gained a lot of national attention because he was allegedly in a vegetative state and he shouldn't have woken up back in 2002 and 2003, I should say. And he violated all the rules, and it was kind of hailed as a medical miracle. But in fact, it was natural history, and he was actually in the minimally conscious state. And he got a full-page obituary in the New York Times, which most of us will not get because it was such an important part of our story in the history of medicine and neuroscience and neuroethics. But the part of the story that I want to tell is how he died. And he died in a way that is equally concerning. He had an extraordinary life with this awakening, all this national publicity, international publicity. It was in El País in Spain, for example. But he also died tragically. You'll recall that when he woke up, his first words were "Mom," and then he said Pepsi, his favorite drink. He was like Rip Van Winkle. Ronald Reagan was still president. And I had the opportunity, with the permission of the family, that's Angela Wallace there with Terry, to review his charts. And it was probably likely that he was in the minimally conscious state for a vast majority of the time after his injury. He had been unassessed by a neurologist for 19 years, according to Jerry, his father. And his body developed contractures. As his mind was getting better, his body was deteriorating. And then in 2009, he turned to his mother. Mama, life is good. That's the happy part of the story. The sad part of the story that I wrote about in the National Academy of Sciences Issues in Science and Technology was how he died. And I think this is really, really something that grabs our attention. Somebody as prominent as Terry Wallace died without the care that he needed, without the rehabilitation he needed. So back in February of 2022, I get a call from Terry's sister, Tammy Bays. And if you look in the Ray-Bans that he's wearing with his brothers behind him, in his sunglasses. And she called me and my colleague Nico, with whom I've been working for over 25 years, along with Joe Giacino. Terry had gotten a pneumonia. The doctors wanted to remove his life-sustaining therapy in a kind of ethos very reminiscent of what Jeff Manley was talking about just moments ago. They couldn't imagine he had a life that was worth living, but he had a treatable pneumonia. He seemed withdrawn. And the doctor said, do you want to be with your mother, Angeli, who had died in 2018? And Terry, who was kind of unclear about timeframes, said he wanted to be with his mother. They took that as meaning he wanted to die. And his sister was alarmed and she called me. Long story, you can read the article if you'd like, but he needed more care, not less. He needed rehabilitation that wasn't available in rural Arkansas. He was too frail to go out of state to get it. A lot of pulmonary toilet was needed, and he died of his pneumonia. And here you see in this story the intersectionality of disability, the current cross currents of the right to die. The right to die evolved in brain injury, Quinlan, Cruzan, and Shivo. And we've overgeneralized the futility of those people to people who actually can get better. And also, we talk about disparities. Access to care in rural America is quite horrific. And I agree with Jeff Manley. This is not a red state or a blue state issue. This is a purple state issue. Everybody, every community will benefit for better care for people with brain injury, whether they're car accident victims or are wounded warriors. But they have these compounding vulnerabilities and need for greater protection. This was a guy whose family loved him. Look at the funeral wreath there. Can you see what's in the middle? It's a can of Pepsi. It was his favorite drink. And I'm sparing you the picture of Terry. In the casket, he was wearing a Pepsi t-shirt. This is a family who loved him. I sent the article to Tammy and she wrote me a letter back and just to say, these people are loved. She wrote, there were many good times highlighted we had with Terry. Even in the state he was in, he loved and we loved him. He sure told us very loud and clear, sometimes many times a day. And then she congratulated me on the essay, and that's not why I'm sharing it, but she said, and I pray that your message gets where it needs to be to help others. And I think that's what this conference is about, the message out to people who can make a difference. And one of the reasons it's especially important we do this now is the neglect of these patients is happening amidst a time of therapeutic and rehabilitative possibility and potentiality. This is a quote from Jose Manuel Rodriguez Delgado, who's famous for the Stimacieber, the neurophysiologist at Yale. And he was talking about the potentiality of the brain is like a beautiful way able to accommodate traffic and facilitate the exchange of visitors among the many cities. The highway, however, cannot create cars, trucks, merchandise, businessmen, and women, workers, and all the life which circulates along it. The road makes functions possible, but by itself is a useless. And that highway system is what Nico and Joe and Stephen Lorries and I have written about, and others, is the meso circuit. And there are ways to manipulate this highway. There are ways to make the injured brain sing and speak again. And that's what rehabilitation is all about. We wrote about this back in 2007 in our Nature paper of a patient who couldn't talk, couldn't eat by himself, and with deep brain stimulation was able to say 6 or 7 word sentences, say the first 17 words of the Pledge of Allegiance, tell his mother he loved her. That's progress. We should capitalize on that. And then we have recent paper that came out here at Spalding, and Joe was one of the senior authors, and I was honored to be in the middle of the pack, is the prevalence of cognitive motor dissociation. These are people who are conscious, but nobody knows it. until you put them into a scanner, you put them into an EEG machine, and you ask them to do a volitional task. These people have more potentiality. So what does this all mean for ethics? Well, new science leads to evolving ethics. And I'm informed by the great American pragmatist John Dewey. Think about what he wrote an essay called Common Sense in Scientific Inquiry. And he says inventions of new agencies and instruments create new ends. They create new consequences which stir men and women to form new purposes. Those instruments, okay, are DBS, neuroimaging, rehabilitation, pharmacology. And then Justice Kennedy in Obergefell says, you know, sometimes you kind of go along with what you think is okay until you realize it's not. And this was in the Obergefell decision. He writes, new insights and societal understandings can reveal unjustified inequality within fundamental institutions that once passed as unnoticed and unchallenged. Now that we know, we cannot look away. And this all had prompted me in my book and elsewhere to write about this in the context of disability rights. This was an op-ed that I wrote in the New York Times for the Disability series. And as proud as I was about the essay, I was more impressed by the image. And this is the image when I was writing about Maggie Worthen, who was the protagonist in my book, Rights Come to Mind, that there's a silhouette. Somebody is not being seen, but she's inside there. And that's what we're trying to get out. And I will say that the 3-hour rule and how we deal with these folks has really created a situation where we're actually segregating people in nursing homes, in facilities, and depriving them of the care they need. They're not medically managed well. They do not get rehabilitation. They do not actually get pain management sometimes because people don't think they can perceive pain, even though we know it is possible. And I think in the aggregate, this is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, both of which call for maximal societal integration. You can't be integrated if you don't have mobility, if you can't communicate. And so I think there's a legal problem here. And it follows in the context of all recent rights movement, right? Women's rights, the rights of education for people who were in the South, and gay marriage. So from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall, the dispossessed had to gain the rights of basic citizenship before they got the protection of the law. So we have to see this also in a legal context and affirm the rights of these people under the ADA and the UN Convention. But finally, and getting close to the end here, Joe, so don't panic, we have to move from rights to capabilities. And Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize, and Martha Nussbaum have written about capabilities that promote human flourishing. And we have to see this as part of a neurotech justice, right? That give them the tools, the means, including rehabilitation, to make progress. Joe and I were involved in a study of DBS in moderate to severe brain injury, and I apologize for the term because I know it's going to become outdated eventually. But I want to share, these are people who actually could give consent, who could actually participate in the decision to be part of the study. So they were not in the minimally conscious state. They were what we call euphemistically the walking wounded. And I wrote 2 very long papers about the narratives. I had an NIH grant to do this, and I want to just share one snippet of it. The mother is writing about her daughter. She's saying after the injury, before the stimulation, she's a totally different person. The essence of my daughter had changed forever. Knowing she could never be who she was before, I had to raise her all over again. And then several months later, after the stimulation, she writes, she told us, I got my daughter back. I got my daughter back. It's a miracle. It's so profound for us. It's a profound change. Now, here come the tears. If somebody told me in August we'd be sitting having this conversation in January, I never would have believed it. It's beyond my hopes, beyond anticipation. Somebody turned the lights back on. Those lights should illuminate the entire country. Those lights should not be exceptional care. They should be ordinary care. So let me end with a summary slide. Okay. I think the 3-hour rule is ethically unjustified and likely a violation of disability law. It precludes recovery before it can even start. It segregates people to chronic care, never to return. It's not like you go to a nursing home and there's surveillance, and if you're getting better and couldn't participate, you come back. That doesn't happen. And I think it's a violation of the ADA. And I think this group should think about whether or not, in addition to legislative and regulatory reforms, whether this should be litigated as a violation of civil rights. And I think there's a strong possibility that I've been working with law students and colleagues at Yale Law School, developing the predicate for this. And I think maybe it's time for that. I also want to say that early prognostication, echoing what Jeff was saying earlier, is inconsistent with the temporal course of recovery. 12 years ago, I wrote this piece for the then Archives of Neurology, and I basically said brains recover by biological mechanisms, not reimbursement criteria. We have to put the biology first and have the reimbursement follow that. I also think the 3-hour rule negates the potentiality of CMD. And it also importantly disregards important emerging therapeutic and rehabilitative efficacy that we can now harness. So let me have my final slide. And this is in Spain, and they're a bit ahead of us. They actually have a day of acquired brain injury, and their motto is one I think we should adopt. Una vida salvada merece ser vivida. A life that is saved deserves to be lived. And I think that could be our slogan moving forward. I want to thank all my colleagues and funders, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe. Joe has been the voice of people who have not been able to speak for themselves for many, many years. His eloquence, again, is, in my view, unparalleled. But we have the great pleasure now of hearing from some people who can speak for themselves from firsthand experience. So we're going to move now to a different perspective. We're going to start with hearing from a person who had a severe brain injury and made it all the way back and then some. And we'll also hear from the mother of a 16-year-old who will tell that story. And then we'll finish up with the Chief Executive Officer of the Brain Injury Association of America, who will, the IAA represents the whole constituency of consumers, and he'll talk about that agency and give us a little perspective from its standpoint. Okay, so let me begin by introducing, I should tell you that once these brief comments from each of the panelists have been completed, Dr. Finns will be invited to come back up, and he will have a conversation with the three panelists. But again, each will share their perspectives first. And our first panelist is Dr. Enrico Quilico. Enrico survived a very severe TBI, went on to complete his doctorate, and he is I believe he's now just finished his postdoctoral fellowship at Baylor Scott and White Research Institute in Dallas, Texas, specializing in rehabilitation and recovery after traumatic brain injury. He was trained at the University of Toronto. He's also well known for the work he's done in developing peer-led physical activity programs for TBI, people who have had TBI, and has become a very well-known advocate for brain injury awareness. One of his accolades includes recognition as a global hero by the Neurological Health Charities of Canada. So it's my real pleasure to welcome Dr. Quilico. Enrico.
Thank you. It's an honor for me to be here today speaking to you about this very important cause. Next slide, please. This story begins when I was 23 years old, an average young man who was very close to his family, and that is my younger sister, Sophia. Next slide. I was a bit of a gearhead, and I lived with my father at the time in Montreal, Quebec. That is my first car, 1993 Plymouth Laser, affectionately named the Blue Beast. Next slide, please. I also loved motorcycles, and that was my father's Honda CB900 touring bike, which I frequently took out for rides in the west end of the city where he lived. Next slide. On May 21st, 2006, I went for a ride on the highway when a car crossed the highway in front of me, forcing me to emergency brake and lose control. I took the initial impact on the left side of my body, fracturing my pelvis, multiple ribs, and my left humerus. I proceeded to skid 80 feet along the pavement and hit the back wheel of that vehicle headfirst, which ultimately led to a severe traumatic brain injury. Next slide. There happened to be a doctor in the vehicle behind me who called the emergency services and an ambulance nearby, which arrived at the scene shortly thereafter. As a medical professional, he insisted that I be driven to the nearest Trauma 1 center. I was unconscious on the scene, intubated, and then rushed to the Montreal General. Next slide. The first urgent problem was the rising pressure in my skull, which was resolved successfully with a craniectomy. Then a week after the accident, my entire system began shutting down. And the team of doctors made one right decision after another until I was stabilized, at which point they were able to focus on less urgent matters like reconstructing my elbow. The next major problem was that I would not wake from the coma 2 weeks after the injury. So my dear parents were called into the treating physician's office and asked to consider my quality of life, if I was not able to regain consciousness, and whether they wanted to keep me on life support. Next slide. Surrounded by my family the entire time, I eventually opened my eyes. Next slide. There were, however, no guarantees about how much function I was going to regain. As you can see, I was not very responsive. I was still missing a bone flap on the left side of my skull, and my dear family was prepared to take on the burden of my full-time care if necessary. Next slide. I spent a month in the ICU and was then transferred to the head injury unit of the General, where I spent another month before I was transferred to the Montreal Rehabilitation Institute. Next slide. Now, my injury happened in Canada, which follows a very different healthcare model than the US. But I can tell you with confidence that at the time I was transferred to inpatient rehab, I was not able to participate in 3 hours of rehabilitation a day. And had I not received the care I did from the multidisciplinary team of professionals, including OT and PT and SLP, a neuropsychologist and a social worker, etc., next slide, I would never have become a fitness trainer and returned to work. Next slide, please. I would never have become involved in endurance sports like triathlon and completed over 30 to this day. Next slide, please. I would never have graduated with a Bachelor of Education from Concordia University and become a language teacher. Next slide, please. I would never have graduated with a master's in kinesiology and physical education from McGill University and become an adapted physical activity researcher. Next slide. I would never have celebrated the 10-year anniversary of my accident in 2016 by running a full Ironman and raising over $10,000 for Brain Injury Canada. Next slide. I would never have started a community-based physical activity pilot program in partnership with the YMCA's of Quebec, the Quebec TBI Association, and 12 people with TBI living in the community in 2017. Next slide. I would never have obtained federal funding to run another cohort of that program alongside my PhD at the Rehab Sciences Institute, the University of Toronto, and the Center for Research and Rehabilitation of Greater Montreal in 2018. Next slide, please. I would never have co-created and implemented a formal version of that program in partnership with 20 more participants in 2019. Next slide. I would never have adapted the program for yet another cohort of participants and tested its feasibility and acceptability during COVID in 2021, and that program is still running to this day. Next slide, please. I would never have graduated with a PhD from the University of Toronto and become a PM&R research scientist. Next slide. I certainly wouldn't be continuing that work here in the US at Baylor Scott & White with like-minded colleagues and friends who care about making significant changes in people's lives after injury.
I want to next introduce Maryam Mohit. You're not going to see Maryam yet. What I'm going to do is play a video that she and her family were very kind to allow us to show you. So we will introduce Ari's journey. It's Maryam and Eric's son. So you'll take a look at the video. We'll go into our third panelist, and then you'll meet Maryam during the panel discussion.
Ari 1.0 before the accident, he loved music, not just listening to music, but composing music, playing music. He loved the outdoors, loved backpacking, loved being with his friends.
Very poetic, soulful kid. Sort of a typical soulful 16-year-old, I'd say.
So this was on, I think it was on a Thursday night, November 3rd, 2022. And he said, you know, Mom, I'm kind of hungry. I haven't really eaten that much dinner. I assumed he was going to go walk around the corner to the corner store and get something, or down the block to our favorite restaurant or get something there. And about half an hour later, I get a call. Hello, are you Ari Blatchford's mother? I was like, yes. Are you sitting down? Yes. And they said, your son's been in an accident. And so about 3 blocks from our house, he had been hit by a car in an intersection. So I got down to the emergency room, and they sat me in this little room with a doctor and a counselor, like a grief counselor. I thought, oh my God, is he alive? They said, yes, he's alive, but he's very, very injured. And I had no idea what to think. I had no idea what we were in for. And then they said, we need to do an operation, and we need to do it right now. We need to do a craniotomy. We need to remove part of his skull because his brain is swelling, and the brain has nowhere to go when it's swelling. We need to relieve the pressure. He was unresponsive at the scene of the accident, right? And so when he arrived in the ER, he was not responsive. And so I started researching what are the places that have programs for brain injury recovery for disorders of consciousness. And there really aren't very many. And especially when you look at pediatric, there really aren't very many. So there was like 5 places in the whole country that I found that had programs that could be appropriate for Ari, where they could take someone who wasn't yet fully conscious and bring them into a rehab program.
We discovered that there are a few facilities in the country that can handle, especially the pediatric side, can handle it with a big, vast trove of experience, that have got all the right staff on site, have got the right associations with local hospitals. And what happened with us is we were looking and trying to do the best thing we could in terms of really assessing our different options, and Spalding just kept on coming up as the top option.
Because this is really the difference between a good outcome where your child actually has a life and them potentially never waking up. Like, it's a hugely important decision where you go to rehab. And I heard that from dozens of families who had loved ones with TBIs, that where you go to rehab is like one of the most important decisions that you're going to make as a parent. So when we got to Spalding, he wasn't making sounds, he wasn't talking, he wasn't eating solid food, he was fed through a G-tube, he wasn't breathing on his own entirely, he had a tracheostomy. So we had so many milestones at Spalding, it was unbelievable. One of the really big ones was the first word that he said. Like, when Ari was in the coma, like, I didn't know if I was ever gonna hear him say my name again. I didn't know whether that would ever happen. And then finally one day, I think it was a month after we got there, he said, Mama. And I literally, like, when I heard him say Mama, I just, like, I really didn't know if I was ever gonna hear that again. And it was incredible. It was incredible. I couldn't believe it. I don't want to make it seem like those things just happened, right? It was the therapists working with him on every single one of those things.
The care that Ari received at Spalding made such a big difference to his recovery that I can't imagine where we'd be without it. Every individual therapist there, and the medical care, the nursing care, the front line are the therapists, the speech therapists, the OT, the people who are working with Ari day to day, and it just is a calling more than anything else. The enthusiasm, the care, it's almost the poetry of it, really resonated with Ari. He understood that these were people who were really on his side, whose only agenda was him getting better, and it allowed him to relax in the most stressful period of his life.
Yeah, he has his whole life ahead of him, and the care that we got at Spalding absolutely has changed the trajectory of his life. And now, he's back home, we're still doing rehab, we're still very much in recovery from this injury. It's going to be a lifelong recovery, but he is walking, he is talking, he's writing poetry, he's studying philosophy. I mean, he's doing so much that I never knew if he was going to be able to do, and he's going to have a full life.
I've just kind of accepted this as a part of life and what my life is, and therefore there's really no choice but to go through it. And as long as I'm going through it, I might as well really kill it, because if I go into it with enthusiasm, it is always easier.
One of the things that's most compelling about Ari is his sense of humor, and his use of metaphor, which is shockingly advanced, is all I can say. You will meet again, Maryam, shortly, but I want to introduce now our third panelist. Rick Willis is the president and CEO of the Brain Injury Association of America, a leading advocacy organization for individuals impacted by brain injury and their families. BIAA's scope of work includes policy initiatives, education, and support services, all aimed at improving quality of life after brain injury. Welcome, Rick.
Great. Thank you very much, Joe. Have to confess, those stories are so moving, and I'm personally moved every time I hear them that I have to sort of regroup myself here a little bit. But what I'm hoping to do over the next few minutes is just to give you a bit of perspective that we here at the Brain Injury Association of America have learned and gleaned from our community and what we experience on a regular basis. As you heard Dr. Giacino mention, our mission is really to accelerate and improve quality of life by accelerating prevention and awareness, research, treatment, and education. We are the nation's largest consumer organization. And on the next slide, you'll see that we really refer to ourselves as being the voice of brain injury. And one of those reasons is because, as I said, we have the largest network of state-based organizations, 26 states around the country that have a state brain injury association organization. We hope that that will continue to expand so that wherever someone is, they will have a state organization that they can refer to and contact. But another reason we say it is that we have, every year, we have around 20,000 individuals that reach out to us for connection and guidance and resources and community through our National Brain Injury Information Center. And they are people like Beth, who on the next slide, I want to just give you tell you just a little bit about a communication that she sent to us that I think is emblematic of many who do. Beth reached out to our organization through our information center some time back, but she is a young woman who has now found herself in the place of being a caregiver for her father. So at the age of 36, her father suffered a traumatic brain injury from a car accident. She was a little more than 2 years into it when she reached out to us. And what you see on the screen is the subject of the communication that she sent to us. And I want to just read to you a portion of what she provided. After telling us a little bit about her story, she went on to itemize in bullet format a number of things that she felt that she needed. And the desperation in her voice, in written form was, you can feel it, because what she said was, what I need is advocacy, advice, tips, tricks, support, knowledge, help, guidance, even more knowledge, tools, trials, the best doctor in the world. I need to see other people my dad's age who have a severe TBI like him. I need to know what doctor wants to take on and learn about the most complicated TBI patient ever. I need there to be more information. I need people to see what it's like. I need resources, exclamation point, exclamation point. I need someone to have my back. Please help us. And she went on to share a little bit more about her experience. But I highlight Beth's story because, again, she's emblematic of the tens of thousands that reach out to us every year. And I think that I also want to highlight it because, as you've heard presented here today in various ways and at different times, you know, and the folks here with us today know, and I know that there are so many misconceptions about brain injury. And so I want you to imagine, and maybe you don't have to, maybe you're a Beth, or maybe you have a Beth in your world, but I want you to imagine what it is like to navigate what Beth is describing when those around you may not necessarily believe you. They may think that you're carrying on, that maybe in some cases, as we've heard from survivors, that their family thinks that they're faking it. So you're not necessarily being believed, or when maybe you're being told that you just have to get used to it, that this is your new normal. Or perhaps, arguably, maybe worst of all, you're going through it and you feel like you're going through it on your own. And we hear that. And so on the next slide, is the reason why, if I was just said in a very high level to summarize that overall, our issues that we see from and that we hear from the community when they reach out to us is that, like Beth's experience, there are many misconceptions about brain injury. And as we've heard already, that there is such an emphasis on, or a point of view, that brain injury is a one-time event, and that there is much of the focus, both in our perceptions around brain injury as well as in our healthcare system, is really focused on the acute side of things. We know that. But what we also know is that the funding for the issue is woefully inadequate compared to the scope of the cause. And so I want to, on the next slide, I want to share with you one more perspective, which is actually from our board chair, Paige Melton-Ivy, whose husband had suffered an anoxic brain injury nearly, I think it's actually more than 2 decades ago. And her story, her quote, actually, and I'll tell you just a snippet more about her story in a second, but she's really highlighting for us in a paper that we published earlier this year on the chronic nature of brain injury. She's also saying in her experience that the emphasis is on treatment in the hospital, but what after that? Are individuals with brain injury supported by therapy and residential options? And if we're going to talk about recognizing, treating, and covering brain injury as a chronic condition, then we also have to make sure there's resources when they go home, whether that's insurance or nonprofit and community resources to continue providing support. But I call out Paige's quote, not only because she's driving this point home, but because in her family, like maybe some of your families, her husband is not the only one. Her husband with the anoxic brain injury is not the only one living with a chronic condition. She also has a type 1 diabetic in her family. She has an asthmatic in her family. And no one questions what the asthmatic or what the type 1 diabetic needs or the care that they require throughout their life. But arguably, the person in her family who is most disabled is the one who's had to fight the most for ongoing continuing care and coverage. And so that's why on the next slide, if I were to summarize what are the things that we need based on the issues that we experience and that we hear from the community at BIAA, is that we need more awareness, not just about brain injury, but about the dynamic nature of brain injury, that it is not static. I know we all would agree that we need increased public health resources that are focusing on the lifelong effects of brain injury and, candidly, better surveillance, starting with better surveillance in many ways. Our friends at the CDC are doing hard work with the National Concussion Surveillance System, but with the monies that they are receiving, we could do so much more than with the monies that they are receiving, again, compared to the scope of the cause. And I know that we would all agree about expanded insurance benefits and supports. We were very pleased, as I know that you all were, over the summer when we announced that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services had officially added brain injury, traumatic brain injury, to their list of chronic conditions. And that is, we, again, very encouraged by that. But what we need now, and what we want to focus on now on the next slide, and what everyone can do, is that we have to speak with one voice. So if we're going to continue to affect change, the community has to speak with one voice. And I know that might sound like an obvious one, but I think that the brain injury community has a very powerful voice. I just don't know that we have used it in the powerful way that we can by speaking unanimously. The BIAA hosts a time in March around Brain Injury Awareness Month where we go to the Hill and we meet with legislators. And the more of us we have there making noise and making our voices heard, the better. We have to take things like the win with CMS, and we have to make sure that that specifically translates into expanded access to care for the community, that it's not just something that's on a piece of paper. We've got it now. It's on the list, but it has to translate to expanded care. And part of the way that we're going to do that is, again, by speaking with one voice. And lastly, we think there's an opportunity for us to really build upon the great work that has been done. I know we heard earlier about the roadmap from NASM around accelerating research and care, but there's much work to be done at a federal level in terms of coordination of agencies. And we see that in other causes around Alzheimer's or autism, for example. We think there's an opportunity to create similarly to create a national action plan for brain injury to build upon and create more of that coordination that we need at the federal level. So we will be proposing that and be talking more about that and getting input on that before we go to the Hill with that in March. But I'm delighted to be with you today. Happy to. I know I want to pass it back to our moderator now, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Rick, for joining us today, but particularly for the instrumental work that you and the BIAA do for patients, for their families, and actually for the providers as well. Thank you for all that work. All right, I'm going to pass the MC over to Dr. Finns, and we will welcome back our speakers, panelists, and Dr. Finns will engage in some discussion with them.
Can't see you all yet, but I want to thank you for those outstanding presentations. And I just want to just say that after you spoke, Enrico, Joe was moved to tears. And I think that just reflects his humanity. And I think it really captures all of us. And earlier we were watching the video about Ari and Maryam, when you mentioned, he said, "Mom," we were all crying too for the first time. And I just want to ask you as parents and as patients who are becoming advocates, and sort of echoing what Rick was saying, how do we take care of people and make the system more compassionate? I want to just frame it by sharing a quote. I had the great opportunity to meet Ari by Zoom a couple of days ago with Maryam, who I've met before. And Ari said this, and he wanted me to share this with you all. And he asked that it be attributed to him with attribution. So I'm not going to take his words. Those are his words. And he said this: "Even though someone survived their brain injury, they're effectively killed by the neglect of the healthcare system." Now, all of you have done just the opposite. Enrico, when you talked about your folks, you said, "my loving family." You use that phrase over and over again. And Maryam, you embody loving family. And Rick was talking about his board chair, who was part of a loving family. What do we do for people who don't have families? How do we make the system more loving? I'll start with you, Enrico, and then we'll go to Maryam and finally with Rick. Enrico?
Thanks. I think it really comes down to the team of care, and there's no question, and I've heard the stories from my family and parents, that when I was in the ICU, there would frequently be told stories from nurses and other professionals just about the likelihood of people who were going to be making it out or surviving when they didn't have visitors, didn't have family and support, and it was a lot lower. It can't be said enough how much the support is necessary. And I think that what that does is, for an individual who does not have the immediate support of family and caregivers around them, that steps up the bill for the health professionals and the care team who's around them. Just to add to that, when I went to inpatient rehab from the hospital setting, so a month in ICU and then a month in hospital on the brain injury wing, and then transferred to inpatient rehab, at every stage there was a huge change. Going from ICU to the 14th floor, the head injury unit, huge drop in services, Cadillac to like, I'm not even gonna say the other kind, and then again, when I went to inpatient rehab, it was incredible. I had a full team working with me and my gains were just skyrocketed. It was like, it was a huge amount of progress in a very short amount of time right away. And as I said, I would not I didn't have the ability to participate in that kind of rehab for that extent a day before I was transferred. So in my opinion, I certainly would not have been, deemed, competent, or I wouldn't have hit the bill for the 3-hour rule.
But you're describing the effects of being part of a human community, because too often people with brain injury are separated from their family, from their community. And there's a community of caregivers. And I think it's good for them, and it was good for you because it keeps them motivated and engaged. Maryam, could you just talk a little bit about your experience in getting Ari to rehab? You told me this story, and I know Jeff was on the line, because what do we do for people who don't have a Jeff Manley in the mix?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I can't tell you, I hear from families every day who are being told that, they need to consider withdrawing care from their child who's in the ICU. And I have to say, the very first time I heard that in most cases, life-sustaining support would have been withdrawn from Ari was today when Jeff Manley said that. And I knew he was talking about my son. And I am so glad that I did not know that at the time. I don't think I could have mustered the hope and the perseverance that I needed to do all the things I did to get him into inpatient rehab if I had been told, you should consider withdrawing life-saving care. So that was shocking to hear today, and I'm glad I didn't know it at the time. It was so difficult. We were incredibly lucky to have Jeff Manley as the neurosurgeon on call when Ari got to the emergency room. And 2 months after the accident, when he was ready to be discharged from the ICU, Dr. Manley sat us down and said, some people recover quickly from these kinds of severe TBIs, and some people don't. And your son is going to be a slow recovery. He's in what is called a disorder of consciousness. I had never heard that term. He is in a minimally conscious state, and he's not going to be able to participate in 3 hours of rehab. Your best shot is to get him into an acute care hospital transfer, so that hopefully he'll be able to get some therapy and at some point be able to meet that 3-hour rule. And so at that point, I had to really work the system. I hate to say it. I had to pull in every favor I could possibly think of to get a bed for him at the pediatric hospital. It was the middle of COVID, beds were full. I racked my brains. I was like, who did I have lunch with 3 years ago who said that they were on the board of this or that? Like, my mother is a physician. She's a psychiatrist. She called one of her patients who had a connect. I mean, it was really like grasping at straws to figure out how to get him a bed in the acute care hospital, right? He wasn't ready to go to rehab. And then, acute care hospitals can be dangerous places. Like, when he was there, he had a G-tube, and the G-tube was being replaced, and the resident replacing the G-tube put it in the wrong way and punctured his peritoneum, and he got peritonitis and septic shock, which sent him into the ICU again for another 2.5 months. He had to have his VP shunt externalized. It was another life and death situation. And then
the system, as you said, you had to put him in the risk for a hope benefit, and it was dangerous. Yeah.
It was, yeah. But then I think one of the most interesting moments was when he was starting to recover from that septic shock complication. And I was literally begging to get him the beginnings of some rehab services. And the person who was in charge of rehab at that hospital said to the director of the ICU, well, it's been 4 months. There's no point in giving him rehab. And I was like, what? Like, it's been, I was like, would he say that if it was his child? I am really looking forward to the day when Ari gets to walk back in and tell that doctor, hi, now it's been 2 years and here I am. So at that point, what I had to do was I really worked with whoever would listen, and I was able to find some disorders of consciousness specialized therapist who I brought into the hospital as my guests, like unofficial guests, to work with Ari, because the rehab specialists at the hospital, they didn't really know a lot about TBI. They didn't have experience. They didn't know what the coma recovery scale was. They didn't know what a disorder of consciousness was. I was needing to explain to them about that, which is ridiculous because I have no medical background whatsoever. So when I got the disorder of consciousness specialist therapists who kind of, out of the goodness of their heart, did this in addition to their regular day jobs, but also I will add at, thousands and thousands of dollars of expense to us. And that's how they started to coax him out of what Ari says is his cave of unconsciousness, and coax him out over time to get him to the point where he could go to inpatient rehab. And so if all of those things hadn't happened, I mean, the video that you saw was made 2 months ago. Already and now we are 2 years after his accident. And already since that video, he's made so many improvements. He's now in school doing 2 AP English classes.
Let me interrupt, Maryam, because I want to underline 2 things that are implicit in what you're saying that I think is important for our listeners to hear. One is that from the very beginning, you needed a care navigator, and it was Dr. Manley who helped to steer you in the right direction. It's not just, where the frontal lobe is, it's where the acute care hospital is, and he knows both. And he got you there. So care navigation is really important. The other thing you're talking about is time, right? Like how long is too long when you don't know how long it's going to take. And I'm reminded here, and then I'm going to turn to Rick to talk about it in a kind of a broader sort of political sense or a policy sense. The Greeks had 2 conceptions of time. They had chronos and kairos. Chronos is, what time is it? How long does it take to get to grandma's house? Kairos is the moral judgment. Is it a good time to visit grandma? Is she up to the visit? And it seems to me a lot of what's going on in our healthcare system is that we're making kairos decisions, the moral decisions, the ethical decisions about who lives and who dies, before we know what the time course is, before we know chronos. Again, chronos before kairos. And I'm aware of chronos now in time because we're going over and we're keeping you from lunch. So I want to now just finally turn to Rick and talk about advocacy. We've had some extraordinary narratives here. We also have Enrico's experience in a different healthcare system, which I think is instructive. Rick, how do we package all this and make a change in policy?
I think 2 things I'll just say in brief. One is, sort of segueing from the original conversation about community. I think that for those that are with us here today, one of the things that we have noticed, or not noticed, but is just really striking, is that when individuals are at the point of care and they're discharged and on to the next stage, whatever that might be for them, they are oftentimes discharged, they and their loved ones, without any awareness of a community that exists for them when they go home. And I think that the more that we together, as the community that's around them, and I'm saying we being everyone here today, can make sure that they know where to go when they're ready, when the time for them is right, whenever that might be, then that helps us with the advocacy question, because I think that the the way that we get things done is by using our voice. And I know that that sounds very esoteric, but truly the more of us that are meeting with policymakers, when you sit down with a policymaker, there's usually just a couple of very questions at the very beginning, and one of them is your zip code. Where do you live? Because that's who they want to hear from, or the people that live in their constituency. So I think that the better that we are at connecting people to a community, big C community that is available for them, so they're not living in isolation, then I think the more that we can connect them to being a community of action through policy. And so I would say that we have to be better at making sure people know where to go when they're ready for us, and that enables us then to be able to leverage our collective voices when meeting with policymakers.
Thank you, all three of you. I congratulate you, Enrico, on all your triathlons and Ironman, and you're inspiring. And Maryam, your family is amazing. And say hello to Ari for us, and we're continue the good fight at the policy and the national level. I'll turn it back over to Joe Giacino now. Thank you.
My thanks to the panel as well, and to Dr. Finns.